Hello, I'm Issac Goodfellow. Those are my cats. I'm a creative engineer at Upswell, which is an experience design agency here in town. While the stuff I'll be touching on reflects some work that I've done for them, I don't represent them in this capacity. I'm not going to say anything bad. I just felt like saying that. Here's one of the things we've done. It's a interactive painting application for kids. It's at the Chrysler Museum of Art. Kids can run across the digital canvas and paint splashes out and smears everywhere. There's also a soundscape that goes along with it. Here's another thing that's from the Chrysler Museum of Art. It's a sort of WarioWare, but for art thing, where all you need to do is be able to touch the screen and do stuff with your fingers. And you have two other people that you're playing with networked, and it projects it. And then the big thing that I've been working on the last 6 months is this, which is a science literacy project for the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And I've been working on making this accessible for fifth graders in the state of Maine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've learned from that, and then a little bit about accessibility more generally. So there's some things to consider before you start doing accessibility work on your game. Accessibility is a huge word. It encompasses all of human ability, which is another huge word. There's not going to be a single solution to this. The way that people talk about themselves in relation to accessibility is as an accessibility consultant and so on. I don't label myself an accessibility consultant, but you'll find that people will call themselves that, but really have expertise in one area. Similarly, in your game, you're not going to have a 100% accessible game just because you've supported colorblind settings. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is still a really young, developing field in general in games, and more so in accessibility because we haven't been talking about this for very long. That means that you are going to have to be a researcher in some ways. You're going to have to experiment with things and try things out for yourself. You're going to have to look at recommendations that people make that are maybe more for the web or something like that and say, this works if you're going through a list and reading text, but it doesn't necessarily work for this adventure game I'm making. So why should you make an accessible game if it's difficult and you have to be a researcher and you don't want to do that to make games? There's some really good reasons. The big one that I'll be talking about a lot today is that a lot of affordances are actually just good design. Things that you can do to make your game more accessible are going to be helpful for all of your players. Because it's about a sort of spectrum of ability, you're going to find things that make it easier to play for some people are going to make it just that much easier for other players too, and smooth out the getting to the good part of your game. Another good reason is that some people use accessible games as a supplement for their therapy, occupational and speech therapy. If you want to talk about expanding your market, every single old folks home, hospital, rehab center, they all have a Wii in them, and they're all playing games that are 15, 10 years old. It's a definite untapped market. So part of this is the cynical slide of there's more players, expand your market. You can build a culture of goodwill around your game by showing that you're a decent person. Novelty and story drive social media shares, so nobody is really doing accessibility that much. If you're the only one out there, it's interesting, it's novel, people want to see that. So somebody asked that I get user stories, and here's one from somebody that's colorblind. I think I put too much into this talk, so I'm going to kind of gloss over this, but largely the gist of it is that he's saying that pretty much every game he plays, he's impacted by his colorblindness and his lack of ability to distinguish between colors that are near to each other. And it ends with a really powerful line that, which I'll read, which is, ultimately, we want games to be as inclusive as possible. I hate to think of somebody missing out on what could have been their favorite game for something as simple as text color. And where that comes up is something like Fallout, where you have a lot of green text with a gray-brown background. That's a really difficult thing for some people. And if you think about, as a creator, would you want potentially your biggest fan to, never have a chance to experience the thing that you've worked on just because of something really simple, like text color? So I'm going to talk about some common issues. A very common one is visual impairment. This goes along a little bit with something that I thought was in the before you start. That's basically, you don't really know what the thing is that you're trying to solve if you have a layperson's opinion. So visual impairment. When we think of blindness as children, we typically think of just like seeing blackness or nothingness, which is typically not how it presents. There's different sorts. There can be a physical impediment with your eyes or a neurological thing. Here on the left is an example of what vision is like if you have a dysfunction of the right eye, where it would just be nothing in that eye. Other people with neurological blindness, like my partner, has a loss of vision in one part of their visual field. So it's your peripheral vision is sort of always gone on that side, which obviously presents some interesting differences in challenges. So some sort of fixes for visual things. Fortunately, these are probably the issues that you can come close to understanding the best as a developer, because there's just whole suites of tools that are made for this. There's a tool for design called the WCAG color contrast checker, and you can see an example of good contrast on those shield emblems in the picture from For Honor right there. They're using a black stroke around a white stroke and then around their actual content. And what that does is it brings it out of the background. So that's something that you could do where you don't necessarily need to turn it off or turn it on. It's just, it looks okay as part of your UI from the get-go. There's also colorblindness simulators, which you can use to compare and see how your colors are going to come out. Another tool is a screen reader. And a screen reader is like Microsoft Narrator. If you've ever had your cat or like nephew jump on your computer and all of a sudden it starts talking at you about everything, that's what that is. You can implement that in a lot of games that are not necessarily like time critical. So like an adventure game or a point and click. Interestingly, Skullgirls has a screen reader, and it's mostly in their menu UI from what I understand. And visually impaired people can play a lot of fighting games from sound alone because there's a limited stage and things like that. Along with screen reader, there's visual highlights. I don't have an example on screen, but that would be like having a yellow outline box around important elements. And that usually goes along with a screen reader sort of jumping between elements that you have selected. So here's some illustration of colorblindness, which is a more specific form of visual impairment. In the bottom, there's the hacking mechanic from Bioshock 2. On the right is normal color vision. On the left is red-green color blindness. You can see that it becomes effectively impossible to distinguish where is actually acceptable to land. There's a little thing that slides back and forth, and you have to like time tapping it. So it effectively just becomes like a random chance for a lot of people. What this affects is UI and like quick read information, similar to that. There's a lot of things that you can do with this. It's largely a visual design thing. So we have FTL on the right, and in the rightmost picture, they're using a pattern to communicate that important information, where on the left, that's just the standard setting. So if you work with patterns, icons, and silhouettes, you can negate a lot of the issues that come with colorblindness. Similarly, you might have noticed that a lot of competitive games use cyan and orange instead of red and green in the last several years, like Overwatch, I think Battlefield, a bunch of other things. Cyan and orange just generally cause fewer issues. Motion sickness. It's a pretty difficult one, so I'm going to gloss over this really quickly. There's a lot of things that we do that add juice that you can just add an option to turn off, like head bob, weapon bob, motion blur, narrow FOV, yada, yada, yada. Hearing impairment. Similarly to the you don't really know what a thing is until you get into it, hearing impairment is not just like a totally across the whole thing impact of your hearing. You can have more or less hearing in certain areas. Like I, for example, can't hear very high-pitched sounds or noise in an environment. Some fixes for this are you can do what's called audio ducking, which is where you have one noise, you programmatically remove other noises. So for example, if you have dialogue going on, you can duck the sound effects around that and you'll just hear the dialogue. Similarly, you can make dialogue not drop off with distance, which is another common problem if you're like trying to follow a character or something and they're talking and it just gets way too quiet. You can also add closed captions. If you're making a more arty-based game and you have puzzles that rely on listening to things, try to avoid just having pitch only. because if somebody is impaired in the upper spectrum, they're going to have a harder time distinguishing pitches. So rhythm-based or volume-based works a little bit better, but you should always have like 2 options for puzzles like that. Motor skills. It's referred to more as dyspraxia. There's generally less you can do unless you're developing a VR or alt control or like game in real life, like Christy's going to talk about. But the biggest thing you can do is key remapping. People will possibly have their own custom controllers that they use for every game they play, and not being able to remap keys really impacts their ability to do that. With motor skill issues, you're going to have issues with either doing small movements or big movements. And so being able to change your UI size and also just like things like sort of auto aim or blocking, making those enableable is good. Another issue you can have with dyspraxia is coordination, so doing 2 things at once. A general good design thing is to avoid making people doing too many things at once unless that's the point of your game. I can't think of a great example of that, but just, yeah. So the big one that people think of, I think, is photosensitive epilepsy. And it's definitely, like, by far the most, there's a good reason it's kind of what people think of. The famous example is the Pokemon episode that has a flash from Pikachu supposedly causing thousands of seizures. It's more prevalent in children. And it's thankfully something that's really well documented. The television industry has been working with this for a really long time, and there's tests and standards. Unfortunately, something that I didn't get to dive into too much in my research was if there is a difference between if you know you have it versus if you don't know. I saw it mentioned in a couple of blog posts, but I couldn't find any scientific literature. But somebody was claiming that the tests are more geared towards people that don't know they have epilepsy. So it's a developing thing. But Microsoft has a test that you can send them like video of your game. And also there's one's designed for the TV industry. There's links to that information at the end of the talk. Another one, cognition. And this is going to range from things like dementia, but it's also going to include like ADD, traumatic brain injuries, sort of all kinds of things that impact your ability to remember, process information, things like that. So something that's helpful with this is notes about what you did last, what you need to do next. And this is helpful for just anybody, because everybody's probably picked up a game after like 4 years and been like, what do I do here? And just put it down immediately. Next, you can add dyslexia-friendly fonts to your game. This includes Comic Sans. You can make... So I look forward to the first post on Twitter about having a Comic Sans only feature in your game. Similar to nothing. That was a transitional statement. Wayfinding. An example of that is Skyrim. There's a spell that I don't know if I've never heard anybody talk about it. It's called Clairvoyance. But when you cast it, you get like a pathway straight to what you need to be doing, which is helpful because unlike a mini map, some people have trouble translating that to the real world. And if you have like any kind of brain damage that affects the spatial mapping part of your brain, it becomes pretty difficult to look at a map and then do that thing in a video game. So having this line to follow is really nice. Like, it may seem like it's cheating, but it's really nice. And it's great for casual players too. Another thing is being able to change the difficulty mid-game. Where this comes in handy is if there's a challenge that's particularly difficult for a player, they're able to lower the difficulty briefly and then raise it back to a level that's a challenge for them, but they're able to get past parts of your game that might otherwise be impossible with whatever they have going on. And then similarly, quick saves. If you are, there are reasons why you would want to space out saves in a game, but it's a good idea to include quick saves so people are able to recover from mistakes that are maybe a result of whatever they have going on. So how can I make an accessible game? I sort of gave some blanket examples. Will is giving me, was that 5? Or does that wrap it up? Okay. Okay. I was trying to remember how much was on the clock when you started, when I started, but yeah. Review game guidelines, pick your target, know what the thing actually is. So part of this is there's going to be a reality of scope. And this is a lot of extra work in some cases to do. So you should target the things that are going to have the biggest impact on your game. The other thing is, do the features feel like they're working with your game? The analogies that I like to use is while there's not like a single button for accessibility, it's more like a keyboard, and you need to like figure out what notes to play that sound nice harmoniously with your game. Yeah, the other issue is you need to be careful if you're just sort of barging into this. Like, you need to be respectful of people because they live this. And if you barge in acting like you have more experience of this thing, or if you start working with them and then say like, never mind, it's not worth it, it's gonna hurt, and it's a pretty crappy thing to do to somebody. So tread lightly, it's personal, it's political, like the communities that you're helping through making an accessible game are marginalized, and you need to respect that. So the other part of that is testing. You can't just sort of imagine what it's like for people. It's a good idea to test the things that you do, which you would with any other feature in your game. And part of this is you should pay people. Like, their whole life is their lived experience. When you pay an artist, you're not paying them for like the however much time they're spending drawing. You're paying them for the rest of their learned experience. Similarly with a person who you're doing accessibility testing with, you're not paying them for the however long you spend with them. You're paying them for their lived experience that you're benefiting from and hopefully making a better game from. So here's some just general good practice. Inform your users up front about accessible options, make things configurable, allow skipping things, have range of difficulty, do a screen reader if it's slow-paced, and yeah, make sure things are legible. And then here's a list of resources, and thank you.